The studio lights were dimmed low. Josie stood between me and the door, her hand resting on the workbench beside my hip. She wasn't touching me, not yet, but the proximity felt heavier than physical contact. The air was thick, charged with the silence of a line finally crossed. I looked up at her, seeing the storm behind her composure, and whispered the truth. This is not about the artifact. Her eyes darkened instantly, the possessiveness shifting from the gold to me. That was the moment the glass finally shattered. But the cracks had started showing 2 weeks ago. The Vane estate sat on the edge of the cliffs, isolated by miles of winding road and the relentless sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below. It was a fortress of gray stone and glass, designed to keep the world out and the collection safe. I arrived with my tools and a reputation for handling the impossible, but nothing in my professional dossier prepared me for Josie Vane. She met me in the grand foyer, not with a welcoming handshake, but with a silent appraisal. Her cool gaze swept over me, assessing my posture and my hands with the same detached precision she used to evaluate a potential acquisition. She was beautiful, certainly, but in a way that felt sharp, almost dangerous. I expect absolute perfection, she said, her voice low and steady. The reliquary is unique. It does not forgive mistakes. Neither did she, I suspected. The commission was the kind that defines a career. A 16th century reliquary, gold and crystal, damaged in transit and requiring a touch steady enough to mend history. The fee was life-changing, but the conditions were absolute. I would live on the estate for the duration. I would work exclusively in the secure studio, and I would have no distractions. Josie held the only key to the room, a detail that felt professional at the time, but soon revealed itself as a method of control. She led me to the studio that first day, the heels of her boots clicking against the marble floor like a rhythmic countdown. The room was climate-controlled, sterile, a vault for dead things. But when she unlocked the case, the artifact inside seemed to pulse with a strange, broken life. It was exquisite, a lattice of twisted gold that had been crushed by carelessness. "Fix it," she commanded, standing close enough that I could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and rain that clung to her. "Restore it to what it was, but do not change it." I set up my station, arranging my calipers and brushes with the ritualistic care of a surgeon. Josie didn't leave. She pulled a high-back chair into the corner and watched. For the first 3 days, that was our dynamic. She was a statue in the shadows, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands as I cleaned centuries of grime from the gold. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was technical, demanding updates on the structural integrity or the chemical composition of the solvents. Yet, there were moments when the mask slipped. I would catch her staring not at the gold, but at the curve of my neck as I bent over the microscope, or the way my fingers flexed after hours of fine motor work. When I caught her eye, she wouldn't look away. She would hold my gaze, unflinching, challenging me to acknowledge the tension building in the silence. The isolation of the house began to press in. The staff were ghosts, appearing only to leave meals and vanish. The ocean roared outside, a constant reminder that we were alone on the edge of the world. By the end of the first week, the studio felt less like a workspace and more like a cage we had voluntarily locked ourselves inside. I worked best in the early hours, when the demands of the day dissolved into the singular focus of restoration. But I wasn't alone. Josie had stopped pretending to read in the corner. I was working on the reliquary's central hinge, a mechanism so delicate it required a microscope and a steady hand. The gold was stubborn, bent out of shape by decades of neglect. I adjusted the clamps, my frustration mounting as the metal refused to yield. I needed leverage, but the angle was wrong. I let out a soft sigh of annoyance, shifting my grip on the fine-point pliers. Immediately, the rustle of silk behind me stopped. The subtle sounds of her presence, the shift of weight, the turning of a page, ceased. Then came the soft, deliberate click of her boots on the floor. She was moving, closing the distance between the safe shadows and my exposed circle of light. She didn't ask if I needed help. She simply invaded the space. One moment, I was alone with the artifact. The next, Josie was there, leaning over my shoulder. The sudden proximity was dizzying. The sharp, chemical bite of the solvents I used was instantly overpowered by her scent. Something complex and dark, like crushed velvet and night-blooming jasmine. Her body heat radiated against my back, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled chill of the studio. I froze, my hand hovering over the tool. "You're fighting it," she murmured, her voice vibrating right near my ear. It wasn't a criticism, it was an observation, intimate and low. Before I could respond, her hand reached out. She didn't take the tool from me. Instead, she covered my hand with hers. Her skin was cool, her fingers long and strong. The contact sent a shockwave through my nervous system that threatened to make me drop the pick completely, shattering the calm I had fought so hard to maintain. "Here," she whispered, her breath ghosting against my temple, warm and steady. She applied a subtle pressure, guiding my wrist, tilting the tool just 2 degrees to the left. It was a correction, yes, but it felt like a claim. Her thumb brushed against the pulse point of my inner wrist, lingering there for a second that stretched into an eternity. She had to feel the way my heart hammered against her skin, betraying every ounce of professional detachment I had left. The metal clicked into place, the hinge releasing with a soft sigh. She didn't pull away immediately. We stayed like that, frozen in a tableau of instruction that had bled into something far more dangerous. Slowly, she withdrew. She straightened, her face unreadable in the harsh task lighting. "Precision," she said softly, her eyes dark and heavy on mine. "You are unflinching. I like that." The fragile piece of the studio shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The heavy studio door swung open, admitting a slice of bright, uninvited hallway light and the booming voice of Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a fixture in the high-stakes art world, a dealer who sold history to the highest bidder. I knew him from a job in Vienna. We had shared drinks and war stories about difficult clients. Seeing him here, in Josie's fortress, felt like a collision of 2 different realities. "There she is," Marcus announced, his voice bouncing off the acoustic tiles, destroying the calibrated quiet. He strode across the room, ignoring the boundaries I had drawn around my workspace. He looked out of place, too loud and too bright, bringing the scent of city rain and exhaust into our sterile sanctuary. "Hiding away in the dark, are we? Josie keeps you under lock and key, I see." He reached the workbench and leaned in, his smile easy. "You look tired, darling. She working you to the bone?" Before I could answer, his hand found my forearm. It was a casual gesture, friendly, the kind of tactile punctuation Marcus used with everyone. His fingers were warm, squeezing gently. "We should steal you away for lunch. Get some real food into you." The temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. I didn't hear Josie move. One moment, she was a shadow by the door. The next, she was there. She moved with the predatory grace of a big cat cutting off an escape route. She stopped exactly 2 feet from us, her gaze dropping to where Marcus's hand rested on my arm. She didn't speak immediately, letting the command hang in the charged air. She just looked at the contact point, her expression so blank it was terrifying. Marcus, oblivious, kept smiling. "Josie, I was just telling our genius here that—" "Remove your hand," Josie said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was soft and lethal. It cut through Marcus's charm like a scalpel. He blinked, his smile faltering, but he didn't pull back immediately. That was a mistake. Josie stepped forward, physically inserting herself between us. She didn't shove him, but the sheer force of her presence forced him to take a step back, breaking the contact. She turned her back to him, walling me off. For a second, her eyes searched mine, dark and frantic, checking for, what, complicity? She turned back to Marcus slowly. "The restorer is not here for social calls, Marcus. She is on a strict schedule." "I was just being polite," Marcus said, his tone shifting to defensive. "We're old friends." "I don't care," she snapped. "Her time is mine. It is billable, and it is exclusive. You are distracting her." "Exclusive?" Marcus laughed nervously. "You make it sound like you own her." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone, suffocating the room. Josie didn't deny it. She didn't correct him. She stared him down until he looked away. "Appraisals are in the library," she said. "Do not come in here again. Marcus retreated, muttering an apology, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence rushed back, but it was different now. It was the vibrating stillness after a gunshot. Josie didn't move away. She stood in front of my desk, chest rising rapidly. I interpreted her anger as professional rigidity, a client protecting her investment, ensuring every minute she paid for was spent on the gold. "I'm sorry," I said. "I know the timeline is tight." Josie looked at me then. Her pupils were blown wide. She looked at the spot on my arm where Marcus had touched me, then up to my face. "I don't like strangers touching my things," she murmured. It was a slip, a blur of the line between the artifact and the artist. She turned sharply and walked back to her corner, but her hands were shaking. The threat was gone, but the claim remained, hanging in the air like smoke. The storm didn't just arrive. It assaulted the cliffs, a physical weight slamming against the reinforced glass of the studio walls. We had been working in a comfortable silence for hours, the rhythm of the rain providing a backdrop to the scrape of my tools. Then, the world ended. A flash of lightning turned the ocean white, and a second later, the main grid failed. The studio plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. It lasted for a single, heart-stopping beat before the backup generators kicked in. The overhead banks remained dead, but the emergency strips along the floorboards flickered to life, casting the room in a low, amber glow. The hum of the ventilation system dropped to a guttural vibration that I felt in the soles of my shoes rather than heard. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The clinical, sterile box where we worked was gone, replaced by a cavern of deep shadows and warm, recessed light. The reliquary, stripped of its harsh interrogation lamps, looked less like a museum piece and more like a secret things whispered in the dark. Josie stood by the door, the sudden shift in lighting stripping away her usual command. The shadows softened the sharp angles of her face, making her look younger, less like the fortress she inhabited. "The sealants," she said, her voice cutting through the generator's hum. "If the humidity controls are down, we have to manually lock the cases." We moved without speaking, a sudden, necessary choreography born of urgency. I grabbed the heavy locking clamps. She held the base of the display units. I passed her the keys. She took them, her movements mirroring mine. In the semi-darkness, the rigid hierarchy of employer and employee dissolved. We were just two bodies, moving in a confined space, united by the singular need to protect the gold. There was a rhythm to it, a passing back and forth that required us to anticipate each other. I would turn, and she would be there, hand extended, waiting for the tool before I even asked. We worked our way around the room, securing the perimeter, the air between us growing heavy with the heat of exertion and the strange intimacy of the dark. We finished at the central workbench. The silence returned, heavier now, weighted by the storm rattling the glass and the amber light pooling on the table. Josie leaned against the heavy oak, the shadows casting hollows beneath her cheekbones. She looked tired, her guard lowered by the adrenaline of the outage. She watched me organize the tools by the weak light of a battery lamp. "Why this?" she asked quietly. She gestured to the array of picks and brushes. "You have the hands of a surgeon, or a pianist. Why spend your life fixing other people's broken things?" I picked up a caliper, turning the cold steel in my fingers. "Artists create chaos," I said, my voice low. "I like control. I like taking something that's shattered and finding the logic in it. There's a peace in knowing exactly how the pieces fit together, in making them whole again." Josie laughed, a dry, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Control," she echoed. She looked at her own hands, empty and open on the velvet surface. "I have everything in the world. I can buy history, I can own beauty, but I can't fix anything. I just keep the pieces in a vault and hope they don't disintegrate. I have ownership, but I have absolutely no control." It was the first time she had sounded human, stripped of the collector's arrogance. She reached for the security ledger on the corner of the desk to log the outage time. I reached for it at the exact same moment. My hand landed on the cool leather cover. Hers landed on top of mine. The contact was electric, sudden and shocking in the dim light. Her skin was cool, her palm pressing down against my knuckles with a weight that felt deliberate. In a normal world, in the daylight, She would have pulled back. She would have apologized for the intrusion. But the generator hummed, isolating us in a bubble of noise and shadow. She didn't move. She didn't pull away. Her fingers curled slightly, not quite gripping, but holding me there. The air thickened, charged with everything we hadn't said for 2 weeks. I looked up. Her eyes were black in the low light, wide and unblinking, fixed on my face. She was testing the weight of my hand under hers, feeling the pulse I couldn't hide, measuring the tension in my wrist. Josie, I breathed. The name hung there, stripped of titles. She leaned in, just an inch, her gaze dropping to my mouth. The moment stretched, a wire pulled to its breaking point. Then, with a violent crack, the main power slammed back on. The overhead lights flooded the room with blinding, clinical white, erasing the shadows and the intimacy in a single, brutal flash. Josie jerked her hand back as if burned. She straightened, the mask sliding back into place, but her chest was heaving, and the air between us was still vibrating with the ghost of her touch. The invitation arrived on a silver tray with my lunch, written in her sharp, angular script. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. Dinner, 8 o'clock. We need to review the completion schedule. But when the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open that evening, it became immediately clear that we weren't there to discuss timelines. The room was a cavern of shadows and candlelight, the long mahogany table set for 2 at the far end, an intimacy forced into a space designed for banquets. I had changed out of my work clothes, trading the canvas apron and denim for a black silk blouse and trousers. It was a small concession to the formality of the house, but as I walked toward her, I felt exposed. Josie stood by the fireplace, a glass of dark red wine in her hand. She wore velvet, a deep midnight blue that swallowed the light, leaving only the pale curve of her throat visible. When she turned to face me, the conversation about schedules died before it began. Her gaze started at my shoes and traveled slowly, deliberately, up to my face. It was the same look she gave the reliquary, possessive, critical, and hungry. She wasn't looking at a contractor. She was assessing a new acquisition, checking for flaws. "You clean up well," she said, her voice low. It wasn't a compliment. It sounded like an accusation, as if my appearance was a weapon I had brought to the table. "I thought the setting required it," I replied, taking the seat she indicated. The meal was elaborate, course after course, brought by silent staff, but neither of us ate much. The air was too heavy to swallow. Josie swirled her wine, watching the liquid coat the glass. "Tell me," she started, abandoning the pretense of work entirely, "does this life suit you? Living out of a suitcase, moving from one broken object to the next?" "I go where the work is," I said. "It's the nature of the job. And who waits for you when the job is done?" The question was sharp, fired with a precision that caught me off guard. She leaned forward, the candlelight catching the gold flecks in her irises. "Is there someone in New York? London? A reason to rush through my commission?" I hesitated. The air felt like a trap. "There was someone," I said carefully, reaching for my water. "A sculptor in Berlin. We parted ways last year." Clink! Josie set her wine glass down on the table with enough force to threaten the crystal. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her hand remained on the stem, her knuckles white. The casual inquiry had vanished, replaced by a cold, glittering intensity. "Berlin," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "So, you are unattached. You belong to no one." "I belong to myself, Josie." She laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "No one belongs to themselves. We are all owned by something. Our debts, our desires, our pasts." She picked up her knife, dissecting her food with surgical violence. "I don't like sharing, you see. When I find something of value, I secure it. I lock the vault. The idea that you might drift to another collector, another commission, simply because the contract ends, it offends me." "It's business," I countered. "I fix things, I leave. That is the agreement." "Is it?" She looked up, and the raw need in her eyes terrified me. It wasn't about the reliquary. It never had been. She was testing the perimeter of a cage she was building around me, checking for weak points. Loyalty is rare, she whispered. I pay for exclusivity. Perhaps I haven't paid enough. The subtext was deafening. She wasn't offering more money. She was demanding my will. The tension in the room spiked, suffocating and hot. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor. I think we're done discussing the schedule, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Josie didn't stand. She just watched me, taking a slow sip of wine, her eyes tracking my retreat as if she knew I wasn't really leaving. I was just running to the end of her leash. 3 days after the dinner, the silence in the studio had mutated. It was no longer the focused, reverent quiet of restoration. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a countdown. The reliquary was nearly finished. The gold was restored to its original luster, the crystal polished to a terrifying clarity. But as the end of the commission approached, Josie's composure began to fracture. She couldn't sit still in her corner anymore. She had become a pacing tiger. She moved around the room relentlessly, picking up tools and setting them down, the sharp click of metal on wood marking time like a metronome. She was agitated, restless, her energy vibrating against the reinforced glass walls. It was impossible to ignore, a disruption making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. She stopped directly behind me while I was applying the final protective micro-wax. The filigree on the left arch, she said. It's uneven. It wasn't. It was a pretext. She leaned over my shoulder, trapping me against the workbench. Look closer, she murmured. My hand, holding the fine point brush, faltered. A microscopic tremor, barely visible, but she saw it. You're shaking, she whispered. My restorer. Are you nervous? The light is poor, I lied. And you are hovering. Am I? She asked, leaning in further. Prove to me you're calm. Check for yourself, I said, a reckless challenge. She raised her hand and pressed 2 cool fingers against the side of my neck, right over my carotid pulse. She held them there, reading the frantic rhythm of my heart. 120, she murmured, her thumb brushing the line of my jaw. You are not as calm as you pretend to be, darling. You're making it impossible to work, I whispered. Then perhaps you should stop working, she said softly. She walked to the door without looking back. The unexpected call from New York was a lifeline, thrown from a world I had almost forgotten existed. It came on a gray Thursday morning, the signal cutting through the estate's isolation. The director of the Archer Gallery wanted me to lead the restoration on a Byzantine altarpiece arriving next month. It was the kind of contract I'd spent 10 years working toward, prestigious, public, and far away from this cliffside fortress. I took the call in the hallway, pacing the marble floor. Yes, I told him, watching the rain lash against the windows. I wrap up here on Monday. I can be in the city by Wednesday morning. I finally ended the call, feeling a strange mixture of relief and nausea. The escape hatch was open. But when I turned around, the hallway wasn't empty. Josie was standing in the library doorway, 10 feet away. She was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, her body rigid. She had just been absorbing the information. The look on her face wasn't the usual teasing possessiveness of the studio. It was cold, absolute fury. It was the look of a queen who had just been told her borders were being breached. New York, she said. The words fell like stones. Wednesday. It's a standard contract, Josie, I said, keeping my voice even. The work on the reliquary is finished. We're just doing the final cure. It isn't finished. She pushed off the doorframe, her stride aggressive and sharp, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The oxidation on the lower hinge is unstable. The crystal setting is loose. I checked the setting yesterday. It's solid. Then check it again, she snapped, stopping right in front of me, blocking the path to the stairs. You cannot leave on Monday. The piece is not stable. I will not have my collection compromised because you are in a rush to get back to, what, some gallery opening? I am not rushing, I argued, my temper flaring. I have given this job everything. The piece is perfect. You know it is. I decide when it is perfect, she hissed. I am the client. I hold the contract. And I say, you are not done. You're inventing problems, I shot back, stepping into her space. There is nothing wrong with the artifact. This isn't about the gold, Josie. You're trying to keep me here. I am trying to protect the integrity of the work. Her voice rose, echoing off the stone walls. Something you clearly don't care about. You treat these things like temporary amusements. You fix them, you take your check, and you leave them behind without a second thought. That is my job. It is a betrayal. The word hung in the air, vibrating. She wasn't talking about the reliquary anymore. Her eyes were wild, desperate. You came into my house, you put your hands on my most precious things, you made them alive again, and now you just walk away? You just pack your tools and vanish? I can't stay here forever, Josie. I have a life. A life? She laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. What life? Running from city to city? Never staying long enough to leave a mark? Here you have purpose. Here you are needed. I am a restorer, not a prisoner. There is a difference, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Only if you want to leave. I am leaving. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her face twisted with a panic she couldn't hide. We'll see, she said. She turned and walked away, leaving a silence heavier than the storm outside. The sound of the latch snapping shut on my tool case was final. It cracked through the studio air like a judge's gavel, signaling the end of the tenure. I didn't look up immediately. I kept my eyes on the black leather handle, my fingers tightening around it, grounding myself against the storm I knew was waiting behind me. The room felt smaller than it had an hour ago. The air sucked out of it, leaving a vacuum that pulled at my lungs. Open the case, Josie said. Her voice came from the doorway, not the corner. I turned slowly. She was standing with her back pressed against the heavy steel door, effectively barring the only exit. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest, a defensive posture that clashed violently with the aggressive tilt of her chin. She wasn't wearing the velvet from dinner or the sharp suits of our morning meetings. She was in a silk robe that looked hastily tied, her hair falling in a dark, chaotic curtain around her face. She looked undone. The case stays closed, Josie, I said, my voice sounding weary even to my own ears. The work is done. The contract is fulfilled. I'm packing the car. You cannot take the instruments, she argued, her voice rising, cracking on the edges. The humidity gauge, the microcalipers. I need to verify the measurements on the base. If you take them, I can't check the structural integrity. The integrity is fine. You checked it 3 times yesterday. I need to check it again. She pushed off the door, taking a step toward me, then stopping, as if she'd hit an invisible wall. Her chest was heaving, the silk rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. You don't understand. The atmosphere in here, it fluctuates. If the gold expands too quickly, the crystal will shatter. It requires constant monitoring. You can't just walk out and leave it to chance. I looked at her, really looked at her, across the 10 feet of polished concrete that separated us. For weeks, I had seen the collector, the woman who owned things, who controlled environments, who kept history behind glass. But the woman standing in front of me now wasn't a collector. She was desperate. Her eyes were wide and dark, frantic, darting from the tool case to my face and back again. She was grasping at technicalities, throwing up roadblocks made of logic that were crumbling under the weight of her panic. She wasn't worried about the gold expanding. She was terrified of the silence that would rush back in the moment I walked out that door. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The anger that had been simmering in my chest since the library argument evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't professional rigor. It wasn't about the schedule or the gallery in New York or the damn reliquary. I let go of the tool case. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. I took a step toward her. Josie froze. She watched me move, her eyes widening slightly. Usually, she was the one who controlled the distance. She was the one who invaded my space, who leaned over my shoulder, who trapped me against the workbench. Now, the dynamic inverted. I walked slowly, deliberately, closing the gap she had been using as a shield. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I kept walking until I was standing right in front of her, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her skin, close enough to smell that intoxicating mix of rain and sandalwood. She backed up until her shoulders hit the steel door with a dull thud. She was trapped, pinned between the exit she was blocking and the reality she was trying to deny. I reached out, but I didn't touch her. I placed my hand on the doorframe beside her head, leaning in, boxing her in. Her gaze was locked on mine, unflinching but terrified. I leaned down, bringing my lips close to her ear, invading her senses. I could feel the tremor in her body, a vibration of pure tension running through the silk. "Josie," I breathed, my voice dropping to a hush that was louder than a scream in the quiet room. I waited until I felt her breath hitch, until I knew she was listening with every nerve ending she possessed. This is not about the artifact. The reaction was instantaneous. She froze completely, her body going rigid against the door. The denial she had been preparing died in her throat. She didn't pull away, she didn't argue. She just stopped breathing, the air trapped in her lungs as the truth stripped away the last of her defenses. The distance between us, the professional boundary we had been dancing around for weeks, finally collapsed completely. She didn't push me away. The denial she had been clinging to dissolved the moment the words hit the air. For a heartbeat, she just stared at me, her eyes wide and searching, stripping away the last layers of the collector's facade. Then, the tension that had been holding her rigid against the steel door snapped. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides in fists of restraint, flew up to tangle in my hair. She pulled me down to her with a force that had nothing to do with precision and everything to do with hunger. The kiss wasn't a question. It was a collision. It was a violent, desperate reclaiming of all the time we had wasted standing on opposite sides of a workbench. It tasted like dark wine and months of suffocating silence finally exploding. There was no gentleness here, no careful restoration of delicate parts. This was raw and messy. She made a sound low in her throat, a noise of surrender that vibrated against my lips, and I pressed closer, eliminating the last fraction of space between us. I needed to feel the reality of her, the solid, frantic heat of her body against mine, to prove that the Ice Queen had finally melted. We stumbled back, away from the door, moving blindly until the edge of the heavy oak workbench caught my hip. I lifted her onto it without breaking the kiss, her legs hooking around my waist instinctively, pulling me into the cradle of her hips. My hands found the silk of her robe, sliding over the warmth of her waist, grounding her, feeling the way her ribcage expanded with every sharp gasp. She broke the kiss just long enough to breathe, her forehead resting against mine, her fingers still woven tight into my hair as if she were afraid I would vanish if she let go. "I hated it," she whispered, the confession tumbling out in a rush of jagged breath. "When Marcus touched your arm, when you talked about Berlin, I hated every single second of it." She opened her eyes, and the vulnerability there was more terrifying than her anger had ever been. "I didn't want to fix the artifact, darling. I didn't care about the hinge or the crystal. I wanted to keep you here, in my vault, safe, mine." "I know," I murmured, running my thumb over the pulse point at her throat. It was racing, a frantic staccato against my skin. "I know. I'm selfish," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I collect things because I can control them, but you were the one thing I couldn't catalog. And the thought of you walking out that door, going back to a world where I can't protect you, where other people get to look at you, it made me want to burn the contract." "I didn't want to go," I confessed, the truth finally finding the air. "The restoration was finished 3 days ago, Josie. I found reasons to stay. I invented flaws in the gold just to have another hour in this room with you. I was terrified to leave." She pulled back slightly, searching my face with that intense, analytical gaze. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Or is it just the storm? Is it just the adrenaline of the deadline?" "Check my pulse," I whispered, echoing her own challenge. She smiled then, a small, genuine thing that softened the sharp lines of her face. She didn't check. Instead, she leaned in and kissed me again, slower this time, a seal on a new contract. Outside, the wind finally died down, the violent lashing of the rain fading into a steady, quiet rhythm. The storm had passed, leaving us wrecked and breathless in the center of the room, surrounded by gold and silence. But for the first time, we weren't alone. The morning light hit the studio differently. It wasn't the harsh, interrogating glare of the work lamps or the dim, secretive gloom of the storm. It was clear, pale coastal sun, washing over the workbench where the reliquary sat, finished. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving the ocean calm and the room feeling settled. I was running the final soft cloth over the crystal housing, a ritual more than a necessity. Josie wasn't pacing. She was standing right beside me, hip pressed against the edge of the table, watching. But the weight of her gaze had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm. She reached out, not to correct me, but to join me. "Let me," she said softly. She didn't take the cloth from my hand. She placed her hand over mine. We moved together, hand over hand, polishing the gold in slow, rhythmic circles. It was a surrender of control she never would have permitted 2 weeks ago. The warmth of her palm seeped into mine, a stark contrast to the cold metal we were tending. It felt like a silent pact, a merging of her possession and my precision into something shared. "It looks new," she murmured, her chin resting briefly on my shoulder as she leaned in to see the reflection in the gold. "It's not new," I corrected, leaning back into her touch. "It's just whole. The breaks are still there, under the surface. It remembers being broken." "Maybe that makes it better," she said. She turned her hand, interlacing her fingers with mine, stopping the work. The reliquary was done. She turned to face me, blocking the view of the artifact, making herself the center of the world. "Don't go to New York." "Josie, I'm not ordering you," she said quickly, the vulnerability flashing in her eyes again. "I'm asking. The Archer Gallery, they want a technician. They want someone to fix the cracks and disappear until the next catastrophe. I don't want you to disappear." She stepped closer, her hands coming up to cup my face, her thumbs tracing the line of my jaw. "Stay. Not as a contractor. Be my partner. Curate the collection with me. Build something here that isn't just about hoarding history, but preserving it." It was everything I had wanted, offered on a silver platter. But I pulled back slightly, needing to be sure. "I won't be another object, Josie. I can't be something you lock away in this fortress because you're afraid the world will touch it. I am not the reliquary." "I know," she whispered. She took my hand, lifting it to her lips. She kissed my knuckles, then my wrist, right over the pulse point she had checked so obsessively before. It was a gesture of reverence, but also of apology. "Objects are kept," she said against my skin. "Partners are held. There is a difference." "And if I leave the estate?" I challenged gently. "Then I come with you," she promised. "I've spent enough time alone in this vault." She smiled then, a flash of the teasing arrogance returning, but softened by the morning light. "Besides, I can't let you leave. Your hands were shaking yesterday. Someone needs to monitor that." I laughed, the sound breaking the last of the tension. "They only shake when you're hovering." "Then I suppose," she said, pulling me in for a kiss that tasted like coffee and promise, "I will have to keep hovering." The reliquary sits finished in its case, cold and perfect behind the security glass. It is safe. But as we leave the studio, Josie's hand is warm in mine. She doesn't look back at the gold. She looks at me. Some things are too precious to be kept behind glass. They are meant to be held. If you've ever felt a tension that threatened to break the glass, subscribe for more stories.